You are listening to AccessUW, a podcast series brought to you by the University of Washington Office of the ADA Coordinator, where we highlight insightful discussions, informative interviews, and valuable insights about accessibility, equity, and inclusion, all within the realm of higher education with experts across the UW. In terms of accessibility, each podcast and a transcript are made available at the Office of the ADA Coordinator's website at www.washington.edu/ADA.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the AccessUW podcast. Thank you for joining us on our previous discussions. Today, we are talking about disability history at the University of Washington specific. And we are excited to have Toby Gallant share some of his research that he did as a student to give us more of a perspective and share some fascinating details about our local history. So welcome, Toby. I'm excited to have you here. Would you please do a brief intro of yourself for the community listening?
Of course. Thank you for having me back. For those who don't know, my name is Toby Gallant. I use he, him, or they, them pronouns. I identify as queer and disabled, neurodivergent, all that fun stuff. For some positionality, I am a tall, white, male-presenting person. I'm in my early 20s. I am a recent graduate of the University of Washington Disability Studies program. And in my senior year for my capstone, I decided to do a 10-credit capstone on timelining disability history at the UW. Specifically, it's a 50-year history looking at specifically disability rights activism as well as student activism at the UW, and really how we got to where we are now.
That's fantastic. No, thanks, Toby. And we want to dive right in. So how did the disability rights movement really begin at the University of Washington?
Yeah, so that is a great question. From my history and what I've seen from the archival records, it actually started with a student group, like we've seen so many other times, and the importance of student activism and leading social movements on college campuses. But it started with a student group on campus that was named Tips and Tires, or the Disabled Student Commission, or State Disabled Student Association. It was a student group mainly of people with physical disabilities, wheelchair users, and other people with mobility aids, who all kind of was banding together as the disability rights movement was taking launch on the national scale. As we know, the disability was not included as part of the first Civil Rights Act. So in the 60s and 70s, we're seeing a lot of movement in the national scale for disability rights and a lot of organizing happening over the country. And it was very similar to what was happening on campus as well, too.
Toby, what era are we talking? Like some years that were starting this? Is this truly 50 years ago you're the tips and
so they began organizing around the 1960s. I believe one date that I can definitely give you is that Tips and Tires were really influential in lobbying to the ASUW, or the Associated Students of the University of Washington. And at this time, they started making diversity commissions, and Tips and Tires pushed to them about how we need to have a disability commission in there too, to basically meet the unmet needs of students with disabilities. So a year after the signing of Section 504, note, this is when it's not implemented yet. So in 1974, the ASUW Student Disability Commission, or at the time was called the Disabled Student Commission, or DSC, was created and founded in that year due to the advocacy of Tips and Tires.
And so I'm curious, was this commission, were they drawing on the legislation of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, or was this a parallel movement?
I think it's a little bit of both, but I think specifically what gave them the leverage to the ASUW was Section 504, that this was now written in federal law, but it wasn't getting implemented and wasn't getting enforced. So finally, for the first time, we can see federal legislation protecting the rights of persons with disabilities, especially in the US. And I think Tips and Tires took that and ran with it, or rolled with it, dare say. But I think it was really the legislation that allowed them to do it. Although it wasn't implemented on the federal level, they leveraged that. Yeah, and it's also important to note as well too of I believe in 1973, Washington State expanded its law against discrimination to include, in scare quotes, handicapped or people with disabilities as a protected class as well. So there was not only national legislation that was yet enforced, but there was also local legislation as well too. Couldn't find too much about how that process went. I was trying to dig in the AccessUW archives, but it's a very big archive to dive through.
That's great. And I'm wondering, can you talk us through or give us some examples of how this group engaged in advocacy and activism here at UW?
Yeah, so I think it's important to note that a lot of these folks not only engaged in activism at the UW, but also external to the UW. A lot of these folks were advocating on the state level. They're the same ones who also created independent living movements in King County, and the first independent living movements ran for and by disabled people. So that was just a little outside of the community. But on campus as well too, the ASUW Disabled Student Commission really by the times of 1977 was pushing for Section 504 to be implemented. And this was a lot of conversations with administrative leaders and making sure that there was a disabled service offices. So students actually supported DRS to get established, which at this time was Disabled Student Services, which is our resource office that provides accommodations and services for students with disabilities. This wouldn't be until 1978, but they were kind of the leading fight and push for this as well too. Of course, the university had to comply with the national standards that got put in place in 1977, but at the same time, these students were actively fighting to make sure 504 was getting implemented at the university itself.
I think it's pretty impressive that our student serving office, right, is 45 years old, while the Section 504 is 50. So it's not many institutions across the U.S. were like the University of Washington, as I understand it. Not everybody established a student office out of 504's legislation. Some of them waited until the 1990s after the ADA was passed. So that's a great local piece of history, and
yeah, and
the
I think
students were pushing for that.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point too to make of kind of the privilege to attend the University of Washington at this time of it wasn't accessible for all people with disabilities. Again, I was saying a lot of these people had physical disabilities because personally, I think those are the people who are allowed and was privileged enough to attend the university at that time because there was not accommodation services. There was no services. There was actually not even non-discrimination in UW policy or state policy yet that basically made sure that these students had equal access to education, into the classroom, to the space. So no wonder they were fighting so hard because they wanted to make sure that them, as well as their following ancestors and other folks with disabilities, were able to attend higher education. So I think that's a really crucial point here of the impact they made, regardless of facing all the barriers and not having any institutional support.
Well, and I think this is a really important point, right? So you're talking about that partly the activism of students themselves led to the institution developing, an entire wing, an entire agency or group to provide accommodations. But were there other examples of ways that they engaged in activism on campus? I'm sure many of our listeners are always looking for ideas for things that they might engage in or ways that they might promote accessibility on campus.
That's a great point. Yeah. So following the advent of 504, they were very focused on getting this law implemented. And once Disabled Student Services, DSS, was established, that's kind of where they moved into programming and trying to do more educational events to bring the awareness of disabled issues on campus as well as different barriers. So in 1979, the Disabled Student Commission had its inaugural Break the Barriers Week, which basically had so many different events that highlighted barriers in employment, education, society, as well as a 504 night and having a lawyer come in and talk about students' rights under the 504. By 1982, they organized its first Adopt a Disability Day, which Heather and I can probably talk a decent amount about this as well too. But the goal of this campaign was basically for non-disabled people, specifically people who are able-bodied, to experience the physical inaccessibility of campus. Remember, this was the pre-ADA era. The University of Washington is a very old institute as well too, so there was a lot of barriers, as well as the campus map at the time wasn't really getting updated on a yearly basis, nor had accessible entrances on it or markings where stairs are like we have now. So they started working together to create this week-long or day-long campaign where students would either rent a wheelchair on campus and basically be tasked to go to different things, such as the libraries, using the bathrooms, going to the lecture halls, basic things that every student does on a daily basis. And there was a lot of articles in the Daily, as well as some Seattle news sources, talking about this campaign and how impactful it was. This was a lot more rooted in a deficit model, but the first time we kind of see the social model coming on campus of, hey, we want to show you the barriers that we face every single day and how that is built by our built environment and not by our disabilities itself. It's important to note that this campaign was also used to the Seattle City Hall by the Disabled Student Commission's founder, Jack Martin, who is also a wheelchair user. In the 1970s, he went to city council to basically advocate for more curb cuts in downtown Seattle and actually had the city council also do an Adopt a Disability Day, which allowed the year following for curb cuts to be implemented throughout Seattle.
So, Toby, I think what's important here, because we're talking about late 70s, early 80s, right? Different era in time. And the discussion of disability was primarily about physical access or visible disabilities, right?
Correct.
Versus how we talk about disability now in the more chronic health and more mental health conversations. But I think for those listening, right, there's part of this history of what was the focus and how they were addressing the primary issues at the time. Like, it was how to get people into physical spaces, right, or navigate physical spaces, because, like you said, right, we had buildings that had stairs, or we didn't have ramps and such. I think there's just some context setting, especially because you also mentioned the Adopt a Disability Day, and I know now in 2023 that may not be seen as as helpful or productive way, right, to educate. So just wanted to name that, that this was helpful and the way to generate conversation, right, in the late 70s, early 80s. And Heather, you're welcome to add anything to that. But just from a historical context setting perspective, but it was also a really big deal, right? You need to get into a building to go to class. You need to get into a building to go to the bathroom.
Absolutely. And I just wanted to follow up. Toby made reference that Toby and I might have a lot to say about what are referred to as simulation studies today. And, what we do know from research is that those kind of simulation studies are problematic, and they often can do more harm than good in terms of, people thinking that they've had an authentic experience of disability by, say, using a wheelchair for a day, which we know isn't true. But just to echo what both you and Toby have said, is absolutely really using this as a means to become more aware and recognize the myriad of barriers in physical access for folks. Like, this was really breaking kind of new ground. And Toby, it's fascinating for me to hear about how student activism on campus was spreading, and picked up and replicated throughout Seattle, throughout the state, and moving us kind of along your timeline. Then you'd mentioned that there was a shift to looking at programs, not just the physical access necessarily of the built environment at the University of Washington, but can you tell us a little bit about what other kind of programs or programmatic intervention occurred at UW?
Yeah, I think right before, a great transition there, Heather. But I am going to stall you just for 1 second because I think something is really important of when we're mapping this too, and we've been saying that kind of how we've been focusing on the physical built environment. And that was all the way kind of until the 1990s, until the ADA. It wasn't until the 2000s that we saw this shift of conceptualization and understanding of disability as well. That's when we saw a rise of learning disabilities and other types of psychosocial disabilities entering higher education because of IDEA and things of the like in federal law. But something that I think is really important to stress is that basically right before the signing of the ADA, students on campus also held a protest in Red Square, blocking the stairs entrance with posters and signs that said access, not aesthetics, things of the like, basically blocking students' access to go into Suzzallo because there wasn't a wheelchair accessible route. I mean, there was, but you had to go through the libraries. It was only open during the weekdays, a certain time. So they were actually pushing to actually have a wheelchair accessible ramp that happened there. And those who are familiar with our university campus now, that's why you can see the zigzag ramp that goes down from Suzzallo all the way to Red Square, because that was actually pre-ADA, right before the ADA was passed. But sorry, just another example of what the physical barriers looked like and kind of the student activism that was happening on campus. But
Absolutely. And I just want to insert for our listeners who maybe aren't as familiar on campus that Suzzallo is one of our largest libraries. The graduate library reading room is in Suzzallo. So it is a main feature of campus that needs to be accessible to all students. Also, Toby, you mentioned another piece of legislation, IDEA or IDEA, which, as I said, I'm going to struggle to remember. It's Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, I believe. Is that correct, Toby?
that is correct. That is correct.
Okay, I just wanted to add that. But please keep telling us our timeline. So now that's pre-ADA, and then what happens in 1990?
Yeah, in 1990, actually, this is kind of where we saw the alienation of the disability community. Following the ADA, there was this rhetoric that all of these barriers that people were pushing for were about to be solved, that the physical environment was about to become accessible. So disability issues didn't matter anymore. But I think also this is kind of the downside of having a narrow conception of disability when they were only putting physical access. We know that all physical access barriers didn't get solved right after the ADA, but it's kind of shocking that the ADA, even though enshrining the rights of disabled Americans into law, was actually the reason why they pushed out the AccessUW Disabled Student Commission. And not necessarily pushed out, the AccessUW Disabled Commission itself decided to leave the association because of feelings of alienation by the association, by the greater campus community, and by administration. And consequently, when the ADA was getting started up and when there was a working group on campus to add accessible signage, parking spots, and other compliance standards, that no students with disabilities were on there, even though they were advocating for 20 years before.
That is remarkable. And, I would just add the larger context of that very much parallels the story of, right after the ADA was passed in 1990, of course, it was immediately challenged in the courts. And so there was a nationwide trend of both kind of diminishing the needs, the access needs of disabled individuals, but also a general backlash, a sense of resentment that these individuals were being more vocal and making demands. So it's fascinating to see this play out at a local level.
It really is. And I know you were talking too about like, where did we see this shift and how did we see this shift? And I really have to say it's because of our disability studies program on campus. And more specifically, it's because of Dennis Lang. But basically, in the mid 1990s, the ADA was now passed. So the School of Law and the Department of Rehabilitation Medicine started to do courses about the ADA and disability, but it was solely based in a medical model of disability, solely deficit. And Dennis Lang, who was alumni to the university, a disabled person himself, also an incredible advocate, who is now outside the community, started seeing these courses and was curious why there was no actual disability studies offerings or disability studies program that is embedded in an interdisciplinary social model of disability that really investigates, critiques, and examines Western's understanding of disability. And by 1999, he was going across the tri-campus, gathering as many professors and affiliates as he could from various departments, courses, all across campus to try to establish a disability studies program. And by the end of 1999, they had a disability studies development committee. And by the early 2000s, we start to see focus groups of intro into disability studies led by Dennis Lang and some other students. But it would be in 2003 where we start to see what I would say the disability justice movement forming on campus. And for those who are unfamiliar at home, disability justice is kind of a offspurt of the disability rights movement. Not sure if I used that word right, but it was following the disability rights movement where it acknowledged that one, it was very white based. It was predominantly by white disabled people. Second, it was very physical disabilities based and not really understanding the whole realm of disabilities and how that can take physical, mental, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is when we start seeing this shift of now that we actually have an education from disabled people teaching other students with disabilities and other students in general, that we start to have this development towards disability justice, and start to see students come back basically being like, where are the disabled students on campus? Where is the community? Where is the advocacy? Because it's now non-existent because the AccessUW Disabled Commission went out. So it would actually be in 2003, winter of 2003, when there was the first introductory course of disabilities titled Disability in Society. And two undergraduate students, Charity Ranger and Katie Colin, enrolled in Lang's class that year. Basically, they came up to them and they were like, hey, all I could find about was disability services on campus, or disability advocacy was DRS, which this was renamed right following the ADA. So now Disability Resources for Students. And they were basically like, where is the disability representation? Where are the community spaces? So in collaboration with Dennis agreed to basically give them extra credit if they wanted to start a club on campus to start working for this. And in 2004, DASA, or Disability Advocacy Student Alliance, was created, with Dennis kind of being the informal advisor. And this is when we saw the spark in disability activism and disability community once again at the UW.
And so I'm curious. So it sounds like there's quite a bit of an evolution here. And you talk about establishing the disability studies program, and that I'm just recapping to make sure that I'm on the right page, and that the first disability studies course was offered in 2003, correct? By Dennis Lang?
That was the first one that was not a focus group. So it was through the Department of CHID, which is Comparative History of Ideas, of those who don't know. But that was from 2001 to 2003 to basically, one, understand students' engagement in the course, to kind of develop the curriculum a little bit more before they had a full-blown intro class. But yes, correct. It was in this early 2000s that disability started developing on campus.
That's incredible. So it sounds like this was really a special topics kind of small seminar of really dedicated students, very invested in creating or re-engaging maybe disability advocacy on campus. And so tell us a little bit. So how did that turn into an actual program?
Yeah. So one, DASA was are you talking about disability studies program or programs sorts of ASUW Student Disability Commission?
Wow, I love that question is so emblematic of the fact of the explosion kind of disability advocacy at this time, that it's like, wait, which program? I would say take your pick, because I want to hear about all of them.
Yeah, okay. Well, they kind of go in conjunction together, and that's why it's a little bit difficult to separate. And I think that's also such the importance of the disability studies program, is without it, I don't know what our community would look like today. I don't know what disability advocacy would look like on campus because they were so back and forth together, working on events, working on things of the like. So they kind of were rising at the same exact time. So by 2004, 2005, DASA actually re-entered the ASUW. And it was actually because of the Women's Action Committee at the time who let them in, let them share office space with them. And basically was helping provide fundings for events such as a body fair on the Hub lawn and some other different events too. So by 2006, 2007, DASA made their case to the ASUW saying the Disabled Student Commission needed to come back, renamed as the Student Disability Commission. Note, this was happening since the early 2000s. So think of how important it was to have students who were educated in disability studies. It wasn't until DASA, who were all students from this focus group, or majority students from this focus group who had formal education on disability, was now able to advocate and actually secure a budget once again, as well as a permanent director for this commission. Again, they were trying from 2000 to 2004, but nothing happened until DASA came into the picture because I mean, we take that for your own interpretation and what you want of it. But I think it does speak to the power of disability studies on campus. In terms of the disability studies program, as Heather was asking, again, same time, by 2005, the disability studies became an official minor. And this was through funding and support from the Law, Societies, and Justice program, or the LSJ program. Why it took 5 years was it was really difficult to find a home for disability studies on campus. For those who don't know, disability studies is an incredibly interdisciplinary degree. So they were debating doing CHID, comparative history of ideas, rehabilitation medicine, the School of Law, et cetera, et cetera. So it took a while for them to find a home, as well as for folks who wanted to give them funding. Funding is always the big key here. And I should emphasize that Dennis Lang, during his time as tenure and as professor, was never paid. Unpaid volunteer the entire time. Honestly, until he retired, which is kind of funny to say he retired because he didn't really have too much of a formal position. He did have support through the Department of Rehabilitation Medicine, which gave him an office and things like to work on these projects. But again, no funding from the Disability Studies program since it was non-existent at the time. But by 2005, with the new minor, there was finally 3 core classes for disability studies: intro class, human and civil rights of disabled people, and disability law policy in the community. Once this happened, there was the Disability Studies Curriculum Transformation Committee, very long name, which was composed of faculty as well as disabled student advocates who were working together basically to trying to cross-list more departments in disability and trying to make the minors have more offerings, but hopefully to actually create an actual program. So this is when the DSP was actually reaching out to scholars of disability studies across the nation of saying, help us, tell us what syllabus should we use, who should we recruit, things of the like. And by 2006, we see the first time the institution actually supports the field of study, with the first formal DSP director coming in, who was Paul Stephen Miller, who is the first director for the Disability Studies program, and was really influential as well as getting it up on its feet and providing some leadership along with Dennis Lang as well too.
I think this is really fascinating. And, I think that Paul Miller is such an interesting character, and his involvement. He was a person of short stature. He was at the law school. He was one of the folks who was involved in drafting the legislation for the ADA. And, I always think about a story that he told about when he got his law degree and passed the bar and was applying for jobs. He applied to a large law office that, when they met him after the interview, said that they couldn't imagine, or they wouldn't be able to hire him because they thought that their clients would think that the law office was running a circus if they had a person of short stature working for them. And so, I'm just thinking about, at that time, the kind of discrimination and stigma that he faced in his own career, in his own life. And I'm just thinking about how all of these individuals just kind of ended up here at the University of Washington working together, and he and Dennis. So I just wanted to insert that note about Paul Miller.
I think that's a great point because this is when community was formulating. I think this is why disability community specifically is so strong at the UW, is because we really pulled these people together and created a safe home. And I think it was really due to the disability studies program. But Bree, sorry, I thought you were going to chime in there for a second.
No, no, it's absolutely. My like reflection right now, if we're talking in this era of time, right, 2000, early 2000s to 2010, there's a little history of like post ADA and like impacts, right, that have happened after we've had that legislation that was about employment accommodations and having more access and employment. Because 504 was so focused on student access or access in certain kinds of facilities like healthcare, right? It didn't really cover employment in the same capacity, but that's where the ADA contributed and brought more rights for employees with disabilities. So what I appreciate about this kind of time frame here, 2000 to 2010, this combining of student activism and employee activism came together. At least how I'm, currently interpreting it to create what was what is now, right? A more full DSP program. This is the early stages of it, but how this legislative things, right, produce more opportunity, more spaces for employees to show up and be themselves more, or pursue their rights, right? And so there's slowly more representation, right, coming into the fold from an employee perspective, not just the student perspective, which I think is only beneficial.
And
Yeah, and
I was just
sorry.
gonna say, isn't that so darn cool? Like, where else do you see that of staff and faculty working together? I mean, we did see it in a lot of other social movements on college's campus, so I will acknowledge that. But how stinking cool is that? I mean, sadly, it was because of a lot of oppression and barriers and discrimination that these folks faced. But they've always been in solidarity with each other, which I don't think we see all the time in academia and higher education.
Well, and how that was probably unique to higher education at the time. I don't know, like in, private businesses, if that was happening the same, but the nature of higher education, well, there are systemic ableism things that are present in us, but the fact that we had our students and our staff, right, working together, I think was perhaps more unique in our setting versus, a non-higher education setting in terms of, places of employment, right? So I think it's a fascinating time, and I love that UW was doing this. I mean, or the people at UW were engaging with each other. So
Yeah, and I would add, thanks to the timeline that Toby has provided, we can do that math and realize that if 504 is passed at least nominally in 1973, right? It's not implemented until 77, but that means that that's a good 25 years. We get to 2000s. We've had a whole generation of people, disabled individuals who went to public school without a question. It was normalized to some degree for them, at least an expectation, right? By 2010, we've now got 35-year-olds in the system who have moved on to college. And this, I think, really emphasizes Toby's point of how having this activism leads to establishing these programs, but it's once students are really exposed to disability studies scholarship and this social model that Toby keeps talking about, that they learn whole new strategies for advocacy and activism, and they can actually apply. They can apply the concepts and the analytical tools and the principles that they're learning in the classroom. It really is this iterative process of both producing and reproducing advocates and scholars. And I love that we can see that through the staff, through the faculty, and through the student advocacy here.
Yeah.
You
So
are
Toby, we're going to get you to cover the rest of this timeline for us. I know we want the listeners to get all the way through current year here, so they can see the whole history that you already know yourself. So where do we go as an institution, right, from 2010 to 2020? I know there's some more student work and other spaces, but tell us about some of the things that continued to evolve on campus in that decade.
Sorry, I'm gonna have to pull us back again before we can go there. But it's still in line of what Heather was just saying too, of now we're having more people in higher education with various other disabilities. And that's what the DRS office was already seeing as well too. By 2008, the director at the time actually put a daily article out there with the director of the Student Disability Commission talking about how they have basically 700 students with disabilities, but 550 of them have non-apparent disabilities. And that's when we saw a lot of actual barriers that were happening in classrooms as well as in disability services as well too. Because for so long we've been focused on the physical access of the campus and not really talking about other accessibility issues such as like services on campus and how these are working together. So the Student Disability Commission actually drafted a ad hoc review committee for DRS that went through the Office of Minority Affairs at the time and got charged all the way up there to the vice provost. And by the end of it, they were calling for a lot of reform as well as how disability services can improve their practices. But what was really cool by 2011, this reform led to more conversations about how there needs to be a disability community center on campus, how there needs to be more connection among disability service offices in the disability studies program and disabled advocates themselves. So in 2011, there was the recharging of the Committee on Disability Issues, or CDI, in 2011, that I believe Dr. Heather Evans was also on as well too. Dr. Evans, would you want to touch base on that and maybe some of your experience on the committee?
Yeah, so for our listeners out there, you can't see Bree and I and our expressions as we both kind of enjoy this trip down memory lane. Bree and I actually met on the Committee for Disability Issues, and what I will say in short, this could be its entire own episode, is that Bree and I were sometimes on the same side of issues and sometimes across the table from each other on certain issues, and developed a very strong collaborative working relationship through that process. But I think, and I don't want to speak for you, Bree, but one of the weaknesses of that commission is, while I think that it had the best of intents, and I think that everybody on the commission was sincerely invested in doing advocacy work, the group itself wasn't infused with any kind of authority or power or budget. And so we didn't actually have the means to implement some of the meaningful kind of changes that we certainly discussed in the committee. Bree, would you say that's a fair summary?
I think I would, but I also want to acknowledge, I think there was, it did serve its purpose to really have that time to reflect on the DRS offering of services and where to evolve, right? Moving forward. And I think so. One of the goals for a period of time, they did a great job on that, and generating conversation and really getting the DRS office to move forward in like the next 5 to 10 year kind of goal, as well as the D Center that ultimately got established. So they're if I kind of break down what they were tasked with to do, there were certain things they were tasked to do and that they were able to actually complete, and got UW leadership support out of the Vice President's Office for Student Life, right, and the University Diversity Officer at the time. But then after those things concluded, it became like what you're talking about. There wasn't as much clear authority or what the goal was beyond just providing advice and feedback, right, through to up into the Diversity Council. But there was struggles happening in terms of where that was going at the same time. So it ultimately ended, right? But I do think there was good history in terms of the some of the specific goals of the CDI over time. But ultimately how it ended, I totally agree with you on.
I think that's a great point, because that's when, once again, we saw disabled students taking action into their own hand, because that's when we started organizing for the Disability Cultural Center, the Disability and Deaf Cultural Center, that was created in December of 2012 with the mission to affirm all bodies, minds, and identities. The center was just a space for students to study, rest, and organize advocacy efforts on an accessible location on campus. Because originally the only space that they kind of had was DRS's office, which sometimes you don't want to be by service providers who might be non-disabled and also just not always the most safe and comfortable place for students who want to share lived experiences and stories and maybe do advocacy efforts that might honestly push back on what DRS is doing or what the administration is doing. So they created the center in 2012, as well as in correlation with Quiet Riot, or what was known as ASL Club, which was formed in 2011, I believe, by deaf folks and hard of hearing folks to come together and spread ASL on campus. This was also after the ASL program was established a little later, I believe in 2010. I might need to look back on the year for that. But we see a lot more development as well, too. So I do want to emphasize, I think you guys are correct. The committee didn't have as much power. I mean, you still got stuff done. You had Kroger come in and Sue Kroger from the University of Arizona, who's a disability expert, to do a review on disability services, as well as a conversation starting of, hey, we need a full-time ADA coordinator, and we don't have a full office for the ADA coordinator. And that was a lot of these discussions that happened in later years as well, too. So even if I know you didn't have the means or the capacities and the ways, these conversations started. And I think that is really impactful there, because where would we be now if we never had those discourse? So that is just all to say, thank you for sitting on that committee. Thank you for dealing with some of the barriers and maybe institutional politics that you had to play through, because it ended up being effective. We created a disability and cultural center for students that is now in the hub and still incredible with putting on events, bringing disability justice advocates, bringing disability studies scholars to campus. There was so much happening in this period as well, too. And by you're going to have to help me, Bree, here. 2018, we had a full ADA coordinator, and finally creating an office of the ADA coordinator. So this is no longer split part-time with another person's position, but someone who can dedicate full access or full responsibility for committing themselves to disability access on campus. So regardless, I think the CDI, Committee on Disability Issues, actually had some positive impacts on campus, even if it was a little bit harder to see.
Yeah, no, you are correct. So 2018 is when the university was able to establish a full-time sole position focusing on ADA coordination versus it being attached with other similar coordination or institutional positions like Title IX or other things of history. So I want to kind of wrap up maybe the last 5 years here to then get some kind of reflection. So we brought everybody up to about 2017, 18, with some, and we can see more branches occurring, right? We have now a Deaf and Disability Cultural Center. We have a revised, reimagined DRS office. We have an established disability studies program with a major and more classes, established and growing, right? In terms of that those parts of campus, more programming happening across the board, and not just about the physical access of history, but other things that are part of the community. So the last few years, right? What are some new things that are key and important to bring us up to current day in terms of our UW history?
This is when, and I like to call this kind of the era of universal design, which is hard because Cheryl Bergstahler on campus has been doing this concept of universal design for the long time. But this is the first time disabled students got their hands on it and wanted to create it themselves. And in 2017, the Student Disability Commission started a Distance Learning Now campaign of promoting remote access for classes and events. This was way before the COVID-19 pandemic when people relied on it. So people looked at us like we were a little wild. Like, why do we need remote access? But again, pushing that narrative of accessibility. And by 2018, interns and the Student Disability Commission was working together to actually create an office to create more inclusive services and programs on campus. specifically with funding lines for ASL, cart captioning, other just universal design services and advice that they can provide. And it was by 2020, 2021 that the Office of Inclusive Design was created in the ASUW. And it was directly by the members of the Student Disability Commission, bunch of interns, and the directors there at the time. And this was another time that a lot of our directors were pushing for more service operators and service providers at disability resources for students. So they were advocating directly to the provost and advocating to a lot of administrative leaders. So this is where we see not only an advancement in disability services, but the importance of universal design and taking us to that next step. As Bree always loves to say, and I like to say as well too, the ADA is simply a baseline. It is what we need to meet, but it's the universal design and student activism that is going to take us to the next level of accessibility and equity and equal access, however you want to put it. So that's kind of where we are now, is the disability justice as well as the universal design movements are really at full force at the University of Washington. And as we reflect on the 50th anniversary of Section 504, we can still acknowledge that there's a lot to go, but at least we can reflect on this rich and resilient history and how we got here today, because it's unique. I believe I keep searching this, and Heather, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe the Disability Studies program at the University of Washington is the only undergraduate major for disability studies in the United States.
Toby, that I think is true. I don't have exact information. I'm not going to claim to totally know, but talking to my colleagues across campuses in the U.S., I do think that there is a lot about our disability studies program that is really unique. And I just have to say, as we reflect on the activism that you have told us about today, that you've also played a really important role in that activism, being very involved your entire career at the University of Washington as an undergraduate, serving in multiple advocacy roles, including running the Students for Disabilities Commission. And so, besides just the powerful scholarship that you've done, putting this timeline together, your own efforts and advocacy and leadership has really played an important part in getting us to where we are today. So to you, to Bree, who's been involved with several of the groups that we've discussed today, I just have to give you both a really heartfelt thank you.
That's very kind of you, Heather.
Yeah, it's very kind. I just want to echo that I was only one person, and I'm built basically off everyone who came before me as well too, and all disabled advocates that came before me. So I'm incredibly grateful, because nothing that I would have been able to do would be tangible without them. So it's just an honor and privilege to sit in that legacy and to say I get to take a part of it as well too. So again, I know we are wrapping up on time here, but I just want to say thank you for having me and letting me share a little bit about this research and this rich and resilient history that is not told or not talked about. And trust me, it took a lot of digging and a lot of negotiating for files and archives. So thank you for this opportunity. I really appreciate it.
Well, we always love learning about history, and hopefully those who are listening to this podcast also appreciate having the context of where we've been and how that's impacting where we are now and where we are going in the future. I think there's many people on campus who are unaware, right, of these level of details and how it has shaped and informed how we work together now and what we're focused on in terms of topics. So I think this is a great opportunity to provide that information. It's definitely a small window into many things, but appreciate your research and time today to share that with us. So,
of course, thank you.
Well, that concludes this AccessUW podcast on UW disability history, specifically on our student advocacy and activism, and how that has shaped where we've come from and where we are going. So thank you all for listening, and we look forward to sharing more with you in our next podcast.
Cheers.
Thanks, Bree.